His hand slid slowly under my dress, tracing a path of shivers along my thighs. I closed my eyes for a second, letting the warmth of his body consume me. His kiss grew more urgent, deeper. As he began to undress me, I could already feel his pants shifting. This is my story. I have been married for 5 years to Daniel, a good and hard-working man who often travels for work. We live in a modest building where every neighbor knows the others. Among them is Felix, our neighbor across the hall, a discreet and single man who doesn't talk much, but is always helpful when he can. That day, Daniel had been away for 2 days on a business trip to Abuja. He was supposed to return the next day. As usual, I was taking care of the house chores. In the early afternoon, just after finishing the laundry, a power outage hit the entire building. It was common here, but that day was particularly hot. I opened the windows to let in some air, then went to the kitchen to get some cold water. As I closed the fridge door, I heard a knock at my door. It was Felix. "Hello, Esther. Sorry to bother you, but my ceiling is leaking, and the water seems to be coming from your apartment." Surprised, I let him in, and we checked the bathroom. Indeed, a thin stream of water was escaping from the pipe under the sink. "Oh, I didn't even notice," I murmured. "No worries. Do you have a wrench? I can try to tighten the pipe." I searched the kitchen drawer and handed him the tool. He knelt down to fix the problem while I stood near the door watching him. That's when something unexpected happened. He looked up at me with a smile I had never seen from him before. "You should avoid walking barefoot on the wet tiles," he said softly. I didn't respond. His gaze unsettled me, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was different. There was something intense in his eyes, something I had never noticed before. For a second, the air in the small bathroom became heavier. I looked away, feeling uncomfortable. "I'll go get a mop," I said quickly. I left the bathroom, my heart beating faster than usual. What was this strange feeling that had come over me? It wasn't fear, nor was it desire. It was a moment of confusion, an inexplicable instant that left me unsettled. A few minutes later, Felix had finished the repair. He stood up and wiped his hands on a cloth. "It's fixed. It shouldn't leak anymore." "Thank you," I replied, avoiding his gaze. He nodded and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he hesitated for a second as if he wanted to say something. Finally, he just gave a slight smile and left. When the door closed behind him, I let out a deep sigh. Nothing had happened, and yet something had definitely occurred. Something invisible but real. That evening, as I lay in bed, I thought back to that moment. I realized that sometimes the unexpected doesn't lie in actions, but in the emotions that catch us off guard, in those silent seconds where everything could change. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Felix's gaze haunted me, not because it had been inappropriate, but because it had made me feel something undefinable, something forbidden. At dawn, I got up early to prepare the house before Daniel's return. I tried to act as if nothing had happened, as if that strange moment between Felix and me had never existed. Yet, every time I walked past the bathroom, my heart raced slightly. Late in the morning, as I was sweeping the living room, I heard a soft knock on the door. I froze for a moment, then took a deep breath before opening it. It was Felix. "Good morning, Esther. Sorry to bother you again, but I forgot to return this yesterday." He held out my wrench. I had completely forgotten about it. "Oh, thank you." I took it from him, carefully avoiding eye contact. He didn't move. "Are you okay?" he asked softly. I looked up at him. His expression was calm, unambiguous, but I could sense something beneath the surface. "Yes, I'm fine," I answered a little too quickly. A silence settled between us. Then, to my surprise, he gave an amused smile. "All right, I just wanted to make sure I didn't make you uncomfortable yesterday. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came. Finally, I just nodded. No, it was nothing. Good. He stepped back, ready to leave, then added, Your husband is coming home today, right? Yes, this afternoon. Then have a good day, Esther. He turned and walked back to his apartment. I stood there, wrench in hand, watching him disappear behind his door. It was nothing. That's what I told myself. That's what I wanted to believe. But as I closed the door behind me, I knew deep down that something had changed. I didn't know what or where it would lead. Maybe nowhere. Maybe it was just a fleeting moment of distraction. But one thing was certain. Felix was no longer just a neighbor, and that was unexpected. The afternoon arrived faster than I had expected. I had cleaned everything, prepared a nice meal, and even put on a dress that Daniel liked. Yet, despite all my efforts to focus on his return, my mind kept drifting back to Felix. Why had I felt so unsettled? Why did his smile this morning feel so meaningful when, in reality, he had done nothing inappropriate? I hated this feeling. Around 4 p.m., Daniel returned. As soon as he stepped into the apartment, his broad smile and warm embrace brought me back to reality. He held me tightly, and I inhaled his familiar scent. He was here, my husband, the man I loved. Everything would go back to normal. I missed you, he murmured. I missed you too, I replied sincerely. We spent the evening talking about his trip. He told me about his meetings, the traffic in Abuja, and the colleagues he had dined with. I laughed at his anecdotes, listened attentively, and, little by little, the strange tension I had felt started to fade. Or at least, that's what I thought. A few days later, Daniel left early for work. I was hanging laundry on the balcony when I felt a gaze on me. I turned my head. Felix was there on his own balcony, a cup of coffee in hand. Our eyes met. I should have looked away, pretended not to have seen him, but I didn't. He smiled, a light, almost innocent smile. Yet it unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Good morning, Esther. Good morning, I replied, my voice lower than I intended. A silence followed. It wasn't an awkward silence, but one of those that feels heavy, as if unspoken words were floating in the air between us. Finally, he spoke first. Last night I heard your husband laughing. He seems like a good man. I blinked, surprised. He is, I said simply. Felix took a sip of his coffee, still watching me. That's good, he said softly. Then he turned and went back inside. I let out a slow breath, realizing I had been holding it. Why had that simple exchange felt so intense? I shook my head and went back inside, determined to stop thinking about Felix, but I knew it was a lie. Days passed, yet something inside me refused to settle. I kept telling myself that everything was fine, that Felix was just a neighbor like any other, and yet I felt an invisible tension growing between us. I didn't mention it to Daniel, of course. How could I? There was nothing to say. Nothing had happened. Nothing except the fleeting glances, the heavy silences, those suspended moments when I caught myself holding my breath for no reason. Then one night, everything changed. Daniel had come home late from work, exhausted. After dinner, he lay down on the couch and fell asleep almost instantly. I stayed up a little longer, tidying up the kitchen, but I couldn't seem to relax. The apartment felt too warm, almost suffocating. I decided to step out onto the balcony, hoping to catch some fresh air. I shouldn't have, because he was there. Felix stood on his own balcony, a cigarette in hand. He never smoked. I knew that because I had never seen him do it before. He turned his head and saw me. Can't sleep? He asked softly. Number you neither, apparently. He shrugged slightly and took a drag from his cigarette. Sometimes the night is louder than the day. I didn't know how to respond to that. Yet, instead of going back inside, I stayed there, looking at him. Then, without thinking, I murmured, "You've been different these past few days." He smiled. "So have you." My heart skipped a beat. He took a step forward, leaning against his balcony railing. We were so close that if I reached out, I could almost touch him. "Esther." His voice was low. A whisper, a warning, an invitation. I didn't know which. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. That's when the door behind me creaked open. "Are you outside?" Daniel's sleepy voice broke the silence. I jumped and turned around immediately. "Yes, it was warm inside," I replied, forcing a smile. He ran a hand over his face and said, "Come to bed." "It's late." I nodded and stepped back into the apartment, my heart pounding wildly. Before closing the balcony door, my eyes met Felix's one last time. He didn't say a word, but he didn't need to. Something had broken that night, and I knew there was no going back. After that night on the balcony, nothing was the same. I tried to convince myself that it was just a fleeting moment, an illusion caused by exhaustion and the summer heat, but I knew I was lying. Felix was no longer just a neighbor. He had become a secret, an invisible presence that lingered in my mind at all times, and the worst part was that I could feel he knew it too. Avoidance. In the following days, I did everything I could to avoid Felix. I went out less, lowered my head when passing his door, and kept myself busy with household chores as if my life depended on it. Daniel, on his end, noticed nothing. He was always caught up in his work as usual, and I played my role perfectly. But Felix, he didn't avoid me. He was always there. Every time I thought I was alone, he appeared. A simple "Hello, Esther" in the hallway, a fleeting glance through the window, a silent yet overwhelming presence. And then, one afternoon, everything changed again. The unexpected. Daniel was at work, and I was using his absence to do a deep cleaning of the apartment, hoping the physical effort would calm my troubled mind. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. I knew it was him before I even opened it. My heart pounded too fast, but I took a deep breath and turned the handle. Felix stood there, hands in his pockets, his expression neutral, but his gaze was too intense. "Is something wrong?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. "No, nothing," he replied. "I just wanted to return this to you." He handed me a plastic container. I frowned. "What is this?" "A dish your husband lent me the other day." I had completely forgotten. I took the container and immediately tried to close the door, but he placed his hand on the frame, stopping me. "Esther?" His voice was low, deep. "What?" I whispered, unable to look at him. He paused for a second before saying, "You're avoiding me." A knot formed in my stomach. "No, of course not." "Then look at me and say that." Slowly, I lifted my gaze to meet his. And that was a mistake. Because in that narrow hallway, with the tension between us so thick, I realized we were walking a dangerous line, and we were too close to crossing it. Felix remained silent for a moment, his gaze locked onto mine. Then he set his beer down on the balcony railing and murmured, "Come on, it's less boring when you're not alone." My heart wavered. I knew I should refuse, but my feet were already carrying me toward his slightly open door. Felix's apartment was bathed in a warm dimness, illuminated only by a low lamp. A bottle of red wine stood on the coffee table. "Do you want something to drink?" he asked softly. I nodded. Felix sat next to me on the couch, a subtle smile on his lips. We talked about everything and nothing, our laughter blending with the soft music floating in the air. There was no awkwardness, no rush, just that silent tension, that lingering anticipation between us. Then, slowly, he moved closer. His hand brushed against my thigh, sending a shiver up my spine. My breathing quickened slightly as his eyes remained fixed on mine. Our faces were so close that I could feel the warmth of his skin, the subtle scent of his cologne. "Esther," he whispered, his voice barely audible. I could have stood up, ended this moment, but I didn't move. I remained there, caught in a whirlwind of conflicting emotions, unable to take a step back.